Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, everyone, whenever you are watching. My name is Maulana Muhammad Akbar, and today I will be reviewing a real estate purchase contract. I am so sorry I cannot show my face when I am presenting because of my ancient laptop just doesn't work. I tried so many times, it just doesn't work. Sorry, and let's get straight to the presentation. Before we go on, disclaimer, any information about name, location, or time in this contract is fictional. This real estate purchase agreement is entered into on July 1st, 2024 by and between Alexander Lane, an individual, so it's not a company or some sort, located at 22 Rue Royal, Oxford, England. Can also be referred as the seller, and Lily White, an individual located at 45 Maple Avenue, Bristol, England, can also be referred as the buyer. Each seller and buyer may be referred in this agreement individually as party and collectively as parties. So this explains who is the seller and who is the buyer and their details. Next, we got property. Seller hereby agrees to sell to buyer and buyer hereby agreed to purchase from seller. This can also be referred as the transaction. All of seller's right, title, and interest in the property located at 74 Brick Lane, London, England. The property being sold is legally described as Lot 74, Block 5 of Brick Lane Subdivision 1, according to the map or plat thereof as recorded in Plat Book 45, page 27 of the Public Records of the City of London, England. This can be referred as the property. Next, we got personal property. The sale includes all of the seller's right, title, and interest, if any, to all real estate, building, improvements, appurtenances, and fixtures. Fixtures shall include all things that are embedded in the land or attached to any buildings and cannot be removed without damage to the property. So in the first part, property is telling that the seller wants to sell and the buyer wants to buy and the details of the property. Now at the personal property, point number 2, explains what is included in this purchase. Next we got purchase price. The purchase price for the property is £230,000. This can also be called the purchase price, payable by buyer as follows. A. Earnest money deposit of £30,000 can also be referred as the deposit, due upon the signing of this agreement and receipt of which is hereby acknowledged to be held in escrow pursuant to this agreement. The deposit shall be applied to the purchase price at the closing. So the total of this property is $230,000. The deposit is $30,000, so the remaining is $200,000 that must be paid at the closing. Point B, closing balance. The remainder of the purchase price is due upon the delivery of general warranty deed at the closing. This amount is subject to change based on adjustment made pursuant to this agreement. As I said before, the remaining £200,000 must be paid at the closing, and the amount of price can still change. Point number 4, disclosures. Seller shall provide buyer with all disclosures and signed disclosure forms as required by law. Seller shall also disclose to buyer in writing any defects in property known to seller that materially affect the value or quiet enjoyment of the property. Buyer's obligations under this agreement are contingent upon buyer's review and approval of all required seller disclosures reports, including any preliminary report. So, this part explains that the seller must tell the buyer any downside of the property that affect the value or quiet enjoyment. of the property. So, for example, if the crime rate is high in the area and it affects the property value, the seller must tell the buyer. If the property is very close to a highway and making it very noisy, it affects the quiet enjoyment of the property, and the seller must tell the buyer. Point number 5, seller representations and warranties. Seller represents and warrants that a seller is the sole owner of records of the property and has full right, power, and authority to sell, convey, and transfer the property. So this seller is the sole owner, and there are no other owner of this property that can make any disputes later on in the future. And because this seller is the rightful owner of the property, the seller can sell the property. B. Seller will convey to buyer good and marketable property by providing to buyer a valid general warranty deed. So the seller must give general warranty deed to buyer to tell that this property is good and marketable. C. Seller is not a foreign person as defined in Section 1445F of Internal Revenue Code of 1986 as amended. This tells that the seller is not a foreign person because a foreign person cannot own a property in the country, in England in this case. 6. Inspection. Buyer obligations under this agreement are contingent upon buyer's inspection of property. Buyer may use any inspectors of buyer's choice at buyer's expense. Seller shall cooperate in making the property reasonably available for buyer's inspection. If buyer is not, in good faith, satisfied with the condition of the property after any inspection thereof, buyer shall deliver to seller a written request that seller fix or remedy any unsatisfactory condition. If buyer and seller are unable to reach an agreement regarding fixing or remedying the unsatisfactory condition upon the final inspection, buyer shall have the right to terminate this agreement and be refunded any amount previously paid under this agreement. So the buyer have the right to inspect the property, and the seller must give that right of the buyer to inspect the property, and the buyer may have any inspectors of his choice at the expense of the buyer. If there are any unsatisfactory condition that is seen on the property, the buyer can tell that to the seller, and the seller must fix it. If the seller cannot fix it, the buyer have the right to have the deposit refunded. Point 7. Closing. The closing of the transaction can be referred as the closing shall occur on 21st of July 2024 and shall take place at Aurorian Cafe, London, unless otherwise agreed upon by mutual consent of the parties. The buyer has the right to make a final inspection of the property prior to the closing. So the closing takes place at a cafe in London, and the buyer has the right to make a final inspection before the closing. 8. Possession of the property. Seller shall deliver exclusive possession of the property on the day of the closing or no later than the next day. So after the closing or the next day after the closing, the seller must give all the documents regarding the property being sold and move any furniture or belongings of the seller from that property so the buyer can have exclusive possessions of the property. Point number 9. Default. In the event of buyer defaults, buyer shall forfeit the deposit to seller as liquidated damages, which shall be the sole and exclusive remedy available to seller. In the event of seller default, the deposit shall be refunded to buyer, and buyer may sue for all remedies available at law or in equity. So if the buyers want to cancel the agreement, the deposit that already been paid cannot be refunded. But if the seller is the one that wants to cancel the agreement, then the deposit must be refunded to the buyer. If the seller did not refund the deposit, then the buyer can sue the seller. Point number 10, governing law. The terms of this agreement shall be governed and construed in accordance with the laws of England and not including its conflicts of law provisions. So this agreement is governed by the law of England and not any other countries. Point 11, disputes. Any dispute arising from this agreement shall be resolved through mediation. If the dispute cannot be resolved through mediation, then the dispute will be resolved through binding arbitration, conducted in accordance with the rules of England Arbitration Association. So basically, don't go to court. Avoid litigation, and if there are any problem, just finish it through mediation, or the more serious type of mediation, binding arbitration. Point 12, amendment. This agreement may be amended or modified only by a written agreement signed by all of the parties. So if there are any change to this agreement, it must be agreed by both parties and written. Cannot be oral and just said like that, must be written. Point number 13, severability. If any provision of this agreement is held to be invalid, illegal, or unenforceable in whole or in part, the remaining provision shall not be affected and shall continue to be valid, legal, and enforceable, as though the invalid, illegal, or unenforceable parts had not been included in this agreement. So if there are any part of this agreement that is invalid, then that specific part only is the one that being cancelled. The other parts that is still valid will be seen as valid, and the invalid part is just like never been there. Point number 14, entire agreement. This entire agreement contains the entire understanding between the parties and supersedes and cancels all prior agreements of the parties, whether oral or written, with respect to the subject matter. In witness whereof, the parties hereto individually or by their duty authorized representative have executed this agreement as of the first date written above. So this agreement is the only agreement that covers the entire understanding between the parties, and if there are any agreement prior to this agreement, all of those are cancelled, whether those are also written or oral. All of the agreement before this agreement is cancelled. And finally, the signature of the seller, Alexander Lane, and the buyer, Lily White. And that's it, guys. This is a really interesting contract, comprehensive enough, but could be more comprehensive if the parties and their legal representative wanted to make it even more comprehensive. There are still a lot that can be modified and added. Thank you so much for watching. I am sorry if there are any inconvenience because of my lack in English prowess and my ancient device. Thank you and goodbye.